debt saturation problem, especially in the United States, but also in Europe as a global system, it reaches a point where the amount of money being printed will incur an interest on repayments, and that interest repayments will exceed the amount of money that is actually in the economy to pay that debt. Right, and so then you're in the vertical part of the hyperinflation curve. That's unless something drastic happens, that happens sometime next year. Then you've got the problems of the food shortages issues. The food production all around the world. The United States in particular has had a lot of problems in its food production. Like there's been a lot of breakdowns and things blowing up and not repaired, and the food system's under quite a bit of strain. But when the actual thing of not enough fertilizer starts to ripple through, and we've got to fall back on stockpiles, the global stockpiles of food, only to find that they have been geopolitically weaponized. That'll become an issue next year as well. At the same time, the oil production in the tight oil sector in the United States, there were predictions that it was going to actually sort of roll over later this year, but one of the fracking fields has actually been more productive than we thought it would be, and so now it's probably next year sometime. Whether it is next year or not, or the year after, it's around now. The implications of these issues are quite large and will take years to fix. The fact that we're seeing them all at once is a problem.
Guys, welcome back to Capital. Today I've got Simon Michaux back on the show. Simon, I think this is the fourth time we've gotten together?
Oh, I've lost count, but it's something like that.
Yeah, so it's been a while since we've last seen you, Simon, and the channel's grown quite a bit since then. So if you don't mind just taking a brief minute, just kind of quickly introduce yourself to the audience who might be coming across your work for the first time.
Okay, sure. My name's Associate Professor Simon Michaux. I work for the Geological Survey of Finland. My education is a Bachelor of Applied Science in Physics and Geology, a PhD in Mining Engineering Explosives. I had spent 18 years in mining and the mining industry research, things like, comminution, flotation, leaching, blasting, all that stuff. For a very short time, I joined the private sector supporting private feasibility studies. I then left Australia and mining and went to Belgium to learn industrial recycling, and I came across the circular economy, and I saw from the inside how the European Commission was operating. And now I'm in Finland, and I came to Finland to do mineral intelligence, but I've since joined the circular economy unit. So I'm working on two fronts, looking at, as we phase out fossil fuels, what do we do in response? And the second front is, how do we manage our resources, and could we evolve the circular economy into something more sensible? Now, I've been working in four broad brush frontiers for the last 5-6 years. And one of them is to actually look at, if we're going to, first of all, what was the status of the fossil fuels industry? Like, can it go on forever, or is it in trouble? The answer is in trouble. Plan B was the green transition, solar panels, wind turbines, and what have you. So, all right, let's look at that. And so I've been looking at that. Would that work if we applied it? And the cliff notes are, we don't have the resources in the ground to actually produce all the renewable energy targets and units. Even if we were to actually apply these systems, they wouldn't be as effective or strong enough to replace fossil fuels, also known as energy return on energy invested. I don't use that calculation, but that's a good way of describing what's happened. Also, the elephant in the room is wind and solar is supposed to be our primary energy source going forward. And they're very intermittent, and they're vulnerable to very variable weather. And so it needs a buffer, because our power needs to be stable, coming out of the wall at the same current, the same voltage, the same frequency, and in a clean sinusoidal fashion to a resolution of a millionth of a second. Right, so it has to be stable 100% of the time. And if wind and solar are going to be the primary energy source, we need a buffer. So the question is, how big should that buffer be? Conventional thinking believes it only needs 5 to 7 hours. And that calculation is based on the day-to-day supply and demand imbalance as you go from night to day over, say, a period of 4 or 5 days. What they have not allowed for is the long-range variations of the difference between summer and winter, or the variations of bad weather. When you get like periods of bad weather that go for a couple of days, and then you get like a sequence of bad weather for a couple of days, then a couple of days that are okay, then another sequence of bad weather, and so on. You have, say, 5 or 6 of those such periods together. How does wind and solar come through that? And so the calculations I actually have used is 4 buffers sizes. One is 6 hours, which is to map what convention thinks. The next one was 48 hours plus 10%. The next one was 28 days. And the next one was 84 days or 12 weeks. And the real answer, and so there's the amount of metal we need for all 4 calculations, and all 4 calculations, including the 6 hour, are showing up material shortfalls. Like none of it's going to work. So looking at some data from the United States with regard to their largest energy power grid that has wind and solar in it, and you look at the actual metrics for wind and solar, the wind and solar consistently underperformed for 6 months of the year, right? And when you actually sort of take a base load, if it was to deliver a certain percentage that it could have supported, when it actually went below that level, it needed 23 days of power storage, but it also needed to actually keep that and distribute that over 212 days before there was any respite, before it could actually recover. And so what that sort of says is the market, and then the grid has to recover after that, which will take a period of time. So the real answer is between 28 days and 12 weeks. Right. So whatever it is, we don't have the technology to store that amount of power for that long. And it's just not going to work. And we need to go back to the drawing board. Right. So that was that phase of work. The work is now being put through the GTK bulletin, and soon it is peer reviewed. It's been accepted through peer review, and it's in the process of being edited, and it's about to be released. Right. So that's that whole era. What I was doing over the last couple of years is presenting this information to many different people all over the world, often government officials, often senior staff members of corporations, managers and executive boards and that. And the pattern I saw in their response really did tell me what needs to happen. So then I went out and I've developed a counter plan. So if the green transition won't work, what might? And so I've lined up all the problems that we have to face, and I've assembled a series of solutions that actually might help us. And so we've got 4 unorthodox technologies wrapped around a reinvented commodities sector. So the reinvented commodities sector is what I call the resource balanced economy. It's an evolution of Jacques Fresco's resource-based economy, but with energy terms in everything that we do. And wrapped around that is 4 technologies. One, thorium molten salt in the form of liquid fuel fission, done on a modular scale. Now, we can decentralize the power grid, and it has a footprint very different to conventional nuclear. That's actually now being developed and commercialized, and it's in the advanced stages of commercialization in multiple operations around the world. And there's actually an operating unit in China selling power. So it's about to break through into mainstream. Second technology is the combustion of iron powder to replace coal to deliver high-end heat as a metal fuel. And then we will recycle that powder through the pyrolysis of human sewage to strip out the oxygen and produce iron powder once again. So we've got the idea that we can burn iron powder as a fuel, but recycle it with human sewage using pyrolysis run by a thorium plant. And so I've got this concept of industrial permaculture, where industrial systems are networked together and optimized for inputs and outputs in much the same way an organic farm would operate, where every operation on the farm has outputs that are relevant to other inputs. For example, if you have horses or livestock, their poo would be used to make fertilizer and compost, which would then fertilize the vegetable patch, and so on. No, wait, the third technology, yeah, it says there's a relationship between a human settlement and recycling an industrial fuel, is what that means. The third technology was internal combustion engines running on ammonia. Now, ammonia is a fuel that is being developed. It's got its problems, but the technology is fairly mature. We could probably do it for all our long range transport, like maritime shipping, aviation in a turboprop sense, and the freight trains that would go between cities. So the reason ammonia is interesting is we can't really store hydrogen or transport it in large volumes. It's problematic. You do it in small volumes, but not large volumes. We can with ammonia, and so you've got to make the ammonia from the hydrogen. That only works if we can make hydrogen without impacting the electronic grid, the electrical power generation grid. So that there is a few innovations in there that bring the hydrogen economy back online. All technologies being looked at in that context are not part of the existing lexicon. They're considered all great. One of them is the use of burning iron powder to produce heat, which would then produce a with a sulfur iodine method for producing hydrogen, can produce hydrogen. And so the hydrogen production then comes back to human sewerage in terms of volume, the volume bottleneck. The fourth technology is electric vehicles will still be needed in some level, but instead of using lithium-ion chemistries, we use other chemistries that are, say, sodium-based or fluoride-based. That apparently is still a controversial thing to say because the world at large is still dominated with the idea of going to a lithium-ion battery chemistry market to the point where they will not discuss anything else. But every battery chemistry I've looked at still needs copper, still needs nickel, still needs graphite, right? So there will be limitations in how many of these units we can put on the ground. So society has to simplify. And also when you actually sort of look at where the energy is spent, when you actually sort of make fossil fuels phased out and you completely change the whole system. There's a few interesting things that come out of that. And one of them is trucks that actually support our society is chewing up most of the energy in the transport equation, non-fossil fuel. So we've got to look at reinventing society in a way where we don't need trucks.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's that. That's the sequence. And now there's other things to discuss there, but do you have something to throw back?
No, I mean, if you look at recent trends lately, it seems like we're rolling back a lot of this, these EV initiatives. Let's say Ford has cut down, Ford has cut down on their EV vehicle output. So have a number of other car manufacturers as well. With this in view, are we, is are we sobering up to the reality that that you've illustrated here? Is there is
So,
there the realistic potential that we could begin harnessing some of these more practical forms of high energy density that we
so
have
my
on the
answer to
table?
that is when I sort of go out and talk to venture capital groups and I present my stuff, they say, yeah, okay, nice numbers, but we already knew that. So what I'm finding is large corporations have done the math and they've done it in the background. They've done it the last couple of years. And they've done it quietly because to say this stuff out loud was very politically incorrect, but they've quietly sort of done the math anyway. And so what we're now sort of seeing is those corporations saying, well, there's no market here, and whoever forces the issue to make the market will lose everything, right? And so they're not doing it. And so they know very well what's happening. However, what we are allowed to discuss in public is still very much ideological. It's aggressively so. We are not allowed to disagree with the narrative. And so there is the message that's coming through, for example, our governments and all our educational hubs and all the discussions about, like anything to do with climate change, for example. They're very aggressive in pushing this particular narrative without saying, can we step around this and do this some other way? They don't want to hear that. And so I'm now sort of seeing in multiple frequencies around me of how society is responding to these problems. So I'm talking about this for 6 years now. And in the beginning, people thought you're crazy. You're absolutely crazy. You shouldn't be talking in these sorts of terms. But now we're actually seeing multiple things on the ground that are showing that the basic thesis I put on the ground years ago is now apparent in practical terms. You know, both the buffer and that wind and solar are not strong enough and not effective enough, and that electric vehicles are not going to work. But society doesn't know how to use them yet. You know, the idea that like it takes too long to charge, it takes like 2 minutes to fill up your tank of petroleum gas at the petrol station and move on, but it was taking like hours a couple of years ago to actually charge your car up, and so that time difference really disrupted how people would use EVs. And so if we were to force the issue, we could do it, but it would require society to restructure itself and adjust itself. And it still hasn't quite come to terms with how to do that. Um,
And now, can this shift happen within a free market framework, or will there have to be a rethinking of this framework in a way? And also, can we do it without like this entire Great Reset dichotomy?
so the Great Reset
Framework.
is the plan that was actually put out by the World Economic Forum. If you own good, you're going to own nothing. And what do they say? You'll own nothing. You'll have no privacy, but you'll never be happier.
And you'll be happy. That's what they said.
Yeah, and it says you stop and think, hang on a sec. And what I took there is that the existing system, and you cover this better than I do, is already loaded up full of so much debt that that debt will never be paid back. And we've been printing money in all sectors, in all countries for 50 years, right? And there will come a point when there's a correction. And what we saw in 1929, and to a lesser extent 2008, banks, for their own survival, will call in loans, and they'll call in the collateral associated with those loans to survive. And so if you have a mortgage and you're still paying off that mortgage, you may find that house being repossessed out from under you, even though that you've been paying your mortgage along perfectly legally and fine. But they'll say in 2008, they'll say things like the value of your house has dropped, and you now owe, even though you've been paying your mortgage steadily for years, it's dropped so much that you now owe more than the house is worth. If we had to sell it tomorrow, pay us $10,000 in the next 10 days, or we'll repossess the loan. It's something stupid like that. I expect to see more of that. And so when they say, well, you will own nothing, it's the banks will then come and take everything as the system crashes. There's many discussions to be had around that, why that is. And in every G20 country, the bail-in legislation of what happened in Cyprus 2011 is actually there. That's actually now the law.
Yeah, it's PR. I mean, essentially, yeah, they're admitting that you'll own nothing, but they're spinning it in a way that it's positive because you'll be happy. You'll be unburdened by private property or the massive debt overhang that most people have nowadays.
Yes, and so it's quite the difficult problem there, it's difficult to see how we're sort of get around that. To answer your question, can the free market actually sort of meet the problems that are aligning? The problem is it takes time to do things, and to do industrial things, it takes you're talking 5 or 6 years of incubation time for a coal-fired power station. That's something we need to know how to do. It's about 7 years build time for a nuclear power plant, and it takes about 20 to 30 years to incubation time to get the permits to do something like that. And so when we hit these problems, they will become very, very apparent. And the way the system is so inflexible and so fragile, we need to have solutions on the ground in a couple of months after we start seeing cracks and pain thresholds. So the free market mentality may be the most economically savvy structure going forward. It also could absolutely destroy society, and there's nothing left for the economy to serve. Right. And so then we've got to sort of understand, does the economy serve us or do we serve it? Just like, does technology serve us or do we serve it? Right. And so the free market, when it sort of hits these sorts of things, will realize there's a supply chain that we've built up. We've completely misunderstood the layer of that value chain of commodities. Where do we get our raw materials from? And how long does it take to get established? It takes 20 years to develop a mine. We can't just throw a switch and bring on more copper production, for example. It takes time. Like in the copper shortfall at the moment that's projected, if someone was to go out and discover a new copper deposit, which we're just not discovering, we're discovering some deposits, but they're not nearly big enough to address the problems that we need. It would take 18 years to bring it online to the point of production, right? And so we don't have 18 years. We've got, when we sort of hit the flashpoint of, um, we will see things get very interesting when the American tight oil sector can starts to peak and decline in production, right? But that's holding up the entire oil sector, and that's not that far away. The conventional oil, crude oil that sits underneath it, well, that's there was a peak. There was a peak in 2005, and there was a localized total peak oil in 2018 in November. But now they're actually forcing the gas industry to make gasoline in a very inefficient circuit. So it's a stopgap measure, and biofuels are a stopgap measure. And so that's how they're holding the market up at the moment in terms of total liquids. But crude oil itself, we're actually on that undulating plateau. Was November 2018 really peak oil? Well, I thought 5 years was enough time to say, because in the background, most oil deposits are declining and depleting at a rate of 5 to 7% a year, and we're not discovering new stuff. So the longer it takes to actually go back and beat that record, the harder it is to do so. But we're still sort of hanging on by our fingernails, like maybe we'll recover, maybe we will. Who knows? But it has the feeling of it's not going to be 10, 20 years away. It's going to be relatively soon. And so when the tight oil sector in America, the fracking sector, they're now the new Saudi Arabia. And so when they actually hit production problems, then it all rolls over. That will put pressure on the rest of the system. And at that point, we will go, now we've got to do something. What do we do? Right. And that's the time that we need to talk about. The market needs to step up and provide new solutions. Problem is, all solutions that we've actually sort of looked on the market, we've discontinued or dismissed for ideological reasons. And we've ignored the idea that the raw materials that we get things from has been considered to be infinite. And they've been considered to be market economies, not natural commodities. They said, throw more money at it and, we'll just discover more stuff and life will be good. Hasn't worked out that way. In fact, when you look at the oil industry in particular, it hasn't worked out that way at all. So we've got a series of ideologies that just are founded in bullshit. But because that bullshit makes us feel good, ideology takes over, and that's what we consider reality. And so for the last 50 years, we've been in a space where virtual instruments have been dictating terms to reality. And so our whole world is virtual. This is the fascination with AI that's just come in. Like, AI will save us. AI will tell us new ways of doing things. Okay, it'll give us some efficiency steps, but it can't magic up natural resources. And it might be able to help us discover new resources, but not enough. We're talking about a between a 500-600 and several thousand% increase in production of resources that has to happen in the next 10 to 20 years. That is such a big jump, and it's not going to be just like an AI giving us new instructions of where to drill. That might give us a bit of an increase, but everything in the background is declining. Yeah. So can the free market help us? Well, it can help us in a context where once we know what the boundary conditions are and that we understand that we need to do it, sure, right? But because we don't want to recognize certain things, the free market will be engaged only when the problem blows up in our face. We point blank refuse to see what might happen down the track, and can we do something intelligent about it? To me, the best solution is a hybrid between the free market and the idea of some kind of foresight, insight, where we understand what it is we actually really want to do to live, to actually sort of have a civilized society that doesn't go to war with itself. and what does it actually need? Know yourself. At a fundamental level, we don't know ourselves, let alone, and we don't know the problems that we face. So now we're going to find out the hard way. So it's the don't touch the stove, it's hot, or we've now got to touch the stove with our lower lip before we have a clue. And so it does mean that we will do things the hard way.
Yeah, and that's basically, in my view, a symptom of having it good for so long. People take for granted the sea of energy, the sea of materials that we currently bask in. You know, everything in this room runs on energy. The lights behind me, this table was created with, through some sort of process that requires a good deal of energy. The lighting here, et cetera. Like everything revolves around energy. The internet, but we've come so accustomed to it. It's like a fish in water. You from the perspective of the fish, the water does not exist, and so one of the drawbacks with the free market is that there is a bit of a lag time in responsiveness to distortions within the market. Eventually the market will find an optimal solution to a distortion, but it does take time. And we're in a situation where time is a crucial factor. But also, on the flip side of that coin, central planning also creates massive distortions in the process. So how do you navigate this fine line between, we need to take action a lot more robustly and quicker, but is central planning really the way to go about this? And I'm not saying that you're advocating for this, but like,
Yeah.
what's the alternative from a voluntary free market framework? Because the natural tendencies for people just, or are you saying we need to like set up a committee or something and let's have them delegate, extraction processes and have them delegate different functions of the economy? Because we've seen the distortions that creates. Because from a free market perspective, you've got 8 billion nodes essentially within a neural network, all making decisions for their own self-benefit that eventually converge to a better solution versus a committee of 10, 12, whatever.
Right. So central planning will only work once we know what to do. We're in a situation at the moment, we've got no idea what a central plan would or should look like. Like all the things that we know with regard to how things should or should not happen are in the process of falling down around our ears. Right. So, and also historically, when we've actually tried central planning based economies, it's always ended badly because human nature steps in and makes a mess of it. Uh, Jacques Fresco used to say to say that a lot of the problems that we have in society are because the society has not been designed properly. So he came up with a series of designs, but they're very far away from what we actually do. So you've got to have a society that actually sort of understands things. So for me, the way forward is this. First, we've got to understand what the problem is, and we can't even get agreement on that. Now, in terms of a gap analysis, what are we looking at here? So it is clear to me that we've got resource shortages coming, and socially we've gone off the rails, and we're about to repeat some of the more unfortunate periods of human history. Again, like we're going through a period of censorship. Words like tyranny is now being thrown around like confetti. Free speech, human rights, all that stuff is now about to go again. So you could sort of say that the design of our current society is well and truly out of kilter. What is missing is we've got plenty of ideas out there, but our ideology and our belief in ideology is what's preventing us from trying those ideas out. We don't know. Like I promoted the idea of say the idea of a thorium molten salt reactor, and people start foaming at the mouth saying, "Oh, this has been around for 50 years. If it was going to work, it would have been done already." And I said, "Well, we've been prevented from doing it. We've actually been prevented from even finishing the work. There's no new nuclear isotope simulations that are actually let me shut that down. That there's no nuclear simulations about what would happen with a liquid fuel in a nuclear reactor. That to do a nuclear power plant, you need to have a simulation of what the isotopes would do in the decay chain. They've done it for solid fuel, but they haven't done it for liquid fuel. So all the people saying that liquid fuel molten salt won't work, they actually don't know that, right? And so the people who are promoting the work to be done and actually are commercializing it and everything, they have done it, but they won't show anyone what they've done. So it now comes out, will their product work? And we're the only ones that have actually got something on the ground are the Chinese, and they're not our friends anymore, right? So we are in a very odd position. So we actually need to get out there and demonstrate post fossil fuel solutions. And we also need to post fossil fuel world solutions, but also a lot of the problems we have at the moment, society at the moment, it says we are convinced that the way we are doing things at the moment is the only way to do it. It's actually not true. So if the free market idea is to work, well, so that'll only work if we've got ideas to look at. And at the moment, we've got conceptual ideas that most are being held up by ideology. So the ideal situation is to set up a whole series of small scale communities that look at ideas and then get the ideas out there, and then we can have the idea of, well, which of these ideas should we use? Now, we will have to collaborate in some form, and we have to have a decision making system of who gets what and who does what. At the moment, we've got a just-in-time supply grid across 6 continents, and we use money to decide who gets what and who does what, but that money is now controlled by a very small number of people as a weapon. It is now outright a weapon, and it's class warfare. We've got to step around that somehow. And so if we have a series of small communities that actually looks at these problems on a small scale, to the point where they have autonomy, if you're going to have, for example, a collaborative and collective effort, then have that effort where it's in a single city where if there's a problem, someone can be sort of held accountable. At the moment, we're a centralized system and everyone's very faceless, and the average person feels helpless. So also from a biology point of view, the size and complexity of an organism is defined by the energy that goes into that organism. That's a fundamental biological science concept, but it can also be applied to everything else. Right. So if we're moving into an era where energy is going to be patchy and unreliable and there's going to be less of it, then our industrial technology system now has to shrink in size and become less complex. So instead of like one system in the center, we're going to have to break up into, at least for a period of time, a series of regional systems that talk to each other. And if over time it makes sense to collaborate on greater scales, then we will do so, but only after we get past this current patch of human behavior at the moment where we point blank refuse to trust each other because of what we actually do. And trust between humans and communities and say things are very tribal. Well, I think we've been encouraged to think that way, because while we're not coming together in large enough numbers to initiate proper change, then the intergenerational criminals that actually run our society now will get away with what they're doing, and thus here we are. And so so going forward, we've got to take control of our own destiny again, but we've also got to choose to collaborate at some point, or we go without. And so this is the thing that we're trying to navigate. And to me, what makes sense is a network of small communities of the order of between 10 and 100,000 people, or 10 and say 500,000 people, something like that. And you have a whole lot of them, and everything they need to function is actually within their city, and then they can trade amongst themselves. And how they trade, like what form of mechanism that allows them to trade, and how do they communicate with each other? And if we can get to the point where each one of those city groups has everything they need because the system's now decentralized, they're less likely to go to war with each other because they don't lack for food, they don't lack for energy. Wealth is now something that each group can generate on its own, and wealth is also something that can't be carried away easily. So what are we really trying to talk about here? Right? Uh, this is actually an evolution of human consciousness and how human beings should actually operate. So we're in this transitory phase, go from here to there. And like 100 years from now, when we all sort of settle down and we've got a new technology, whatever that is, and we've worked out a way of living, whatever that is, there's a lot of fears of unknown at the moment. So we don't know what to do. We don't know where to go. We don't know what to try. Once we get past all that and we sort of, develop the best we can, um, I would like to see humanity understand how often it has been talked into conflict by bullshit artists that are never held accountable. And a lot of these wars never had to happen. And they were there to make money, or they were there to reorganize, how society organizes itself. It was all bullshit.
Yeah, I mean, you could pretty much reduce every single war throughout history to economic reasons. Most if not all wars are all economic. There's window dressing about certain themes here and there, but when you really strip it down, it's always about economics. Are you in the market for gold and silver? Then if so, please consider Miles Franklin. They are my gold and silver dealer of choice. So not only do they have super competitive prices that you're going to have a really hard time finding elsewhere, but then they also have top-notch customer support. I know Andy Schechtman, the owner of Miles Franklin, top-notch guy. I wouldn't be recommending them to you if I didn't have faith in their product. But what you really want to do, however, you want to email them at info@milesfranklin.com, and you want to say that Capital Cosmos sent me in the description line, because when you do that, you can get access to their special pricing sheet. You want to get that special pricing sheet because you're going to get special prices that you won't find on the website itself. So email them at info@milesfranklin.com. Tell them that Capital Cosmos sent you, and you won't be heckled with spam emails, etc. There's no commitment necessary. I promise you that. And with that said, I will let you get back to the video. And so, what's your biggest concern now, Simon? Out of everything we've talked about, what's your biggest immediate concern from where we currently stand?
Okay, we are hopelessly held hostage by a series of ideologies that are keeping us in tribes and is actually keeping us from having a frank discussion. We are encouraged to be so unkind to each other. Look at the political debate that's happening in the US at the moment about how the different party supporters see each other. It is full on. It's like they've been encouraged to fight each other. There's no empathy there at all. And a lot of it is bullshit. It is absolute bullshit. A lot of what's actually sort of been talked about, so my biggest concern at the moment is humanity at large, all over the world, has been convinced to believe a series of things and ideologies that are simply not true, but their ability to reason has been replaced with a lack of empathy, where we don't think for ourselves, we do what we're told. And our beliefs, I believe, are being socially conditioned. Right? We are socially conditioned to believe certain things and will behave a certain way. The forces of propaganda, Edward Bernays' propaganda methodology has been used to actually shape society and what we believe and what we do. And we've given away our power to the point where democracy is not really democracy anymore. We are at a very dangerous point in history. On the other hand, if we see what's happening around us, we can come through that and actually reform democracy again. So my biggest fear at the moment is we stay in this state of stupor. Is there a better way to say that? I'm not sure, but it's not stupidity that is actually holding us back, and it's not indifference either. It's this.
It's the algorithm. I mean, it's algorithmic siloing of people. People are living in their own tailored algorithm of where they just get the information that best resonates engagement with them.
We're bombarded with fear porn. It's one problem after another, and the problems arrive a couple of months apart. The COVID thing happened. Then it was the war in Ukraine. And all of a sudden COVID was solved. It was like we are programmed as a group to go after certain issues.
It does seem like a TV show.
I call it the apocalypse theater. Um, Joseph P. Farrell wrote a book called Apocalypse Theater, which is very interesting.
Hmm.
Anyway, so and when we as a society are constantly bombarded with, the world is ending, you know, you're about to be taken to the cleaners. We've got this, we've got that. Um, it makes us very susceptible to suggestion, and it's very hard to logic over. And we have such trust in authority and institutions because that's what they were created to be by us several centuries ago. But unfortunately, those institutions have well and truly lost their way and don't deserve that trust. So we've got to start thinking for ourselves and start just instead of blindly accepting what we are told. The number of issues that we have just we are told this whole conflict between the Russians and the West. I've got a model for what I think is happening there, and it's
Hmm.
very different to what's happening on TV, so to speak. But we are being talked into a third world war, a possible nuclear war, and you talk to people on the ground. No one actually wants this, and it's very hard to describe why is this actually happening. Yet here we are, and what is not what is not being discussed openly in the media is some of the actions that we in the West are actually taking, which really, makes people sort of, it's like our leaders don't want peace; they want war. The favorite one for me was uh, uh, in Ukraine under NATO leadership, the Americans in particular, I believe, they actually launched a series of strikes into Russian territory and actually took out several sites, two of which were early warning systems for a nuclear strike. And at the time, they actually had in the air a nuclear capable B-52 making a run in St. Petersburg as an exercise. Right now, we did that. It's like our leadership wants to get the Russians to do something stupid, and so then they can have their war. And I think I understand why all that is happening, but the people on the ground want nothing to do with this. It's as I said, it's all bullshit. It's theater. But this is how a lot of people can get hurt.
Yeah, I think it really boils down to the fact that getting a little geopolitical here, but Russia hasn't really built up its military over the last 10 years in the same way that Ukraine has. Ukraine's been building up its military since the Maidan coup.
Hmm.
At the behest of the United States and NATO in general. But Russia hasn't. It's still a voluntary military force. There's no conscription or anything. So, in that sense, Russia does have it does have a sort of a boots on the ground problem. That's why they couldn't properly defend their own territory in Kursk. And
So,
so that's
I
why you
see
see all
the
this saber rattling about nukes, and because that's what really Russia has to depend on is the threat of force through nuclear weapons. And I think what's going on is that the West is simply calling Russia's bluff on that. They don't believe that Russia will actually detonate a tactical nuke, and so they're continuing to poke the bear, for lack of a better term, or
so what I see from our leadership, and I see the Anglo West in general, is panic. And my understanding of what's happening here is this is actually an economic war, not a physical one, not a kinetic one.
hmm,
And we're seeing and to me, it's the combatants are the BRICS economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are actually having a long range plan to get out from under the Anglo
hmm.
petrodollar system, which is a fiat currency system, and it's saturated with debt. And it's all about control and coercion. And if peak oil really was November 2018, and even if it wasn't, it's a shot across the bows, as in it's around now in terms of a couple of years, then all fossil fuels will be um, will have to be revalued in economic terms. Now, but Russia is one of the countries that sells fossil fuels,
Right.
oil and gas, and to a lesser extent coal. Um, Now, if it was to actually do that, it's a breach of international contract law because these contracts go for 40, 50 years. As in they're not short contracts. So to actually how do they go about revaluing that? And so it's the timing is now. In 2023, the Basel III Accord, banking accord, went live. As in, it was developed a year earlier, and then it was stress tested, and it went live sometime in 2023. In that was the possibility of using gold and other commodities as a currency backing tool in the central bank system. That was the year that the Ukrainian monkey business kicked off. And there was a phase associated with it. I believe it was 2023. It could have been a little earlier, but it was around then. Um, and I believe the Russians tried to put the Europeans in a position where um, we were to be forced into doing something we didn't want to do. The Russians had the goal of getting recognized their currency, the ruble, which is now partially backed by commodities, that was restructured. That doesn't just happen overnight. So the Russians move into Ukraine, and so there's that whole discussion, especially what was been going down since 2014 and all that. What do? We hit them with economic sanctions, everything we can think of. Those economic sanctions are a breach of international contract law. Ethics aside, morality aside, they are a breach of international contract law. So the Russians convinced us to break international contract law before them. So the Russians can then just say, right, if you want gas, you will now pay for rubles in rubles. And it's not that the Russian gas was unavailable or they wouldn't sell it. It's we wouldn't use Russian rubles as a currency. So that whole conflict we're seeing in Ukraine, it comes down to our refusal to use a currency exchange platform. And that told me the war is actually economic.
Mm-hmm.
The true goals are economic. So, all right. So we've got the Europeans say, while the American Inflation Reduction Act was being written to attract businesses to America, the Europeans were told by the Americans sanction Russia, which they did, and a lot of heavy industry is now leaving Europe. Where's it going? America. And they're using phrases like, we will never weaponize your gas supply. It wasn't the Russians that did that, it was the Europeans. Right. So we are being convinced to do dumb things on behalf of someone else. And to me, the whole thing is of maintenance of the Anglo-American petrodollar empire managed out of London. Right. And so this is the big conflict. So all right, so we sanction Russia. Russia then says, well, pay gas with rubles. We say that's unacceptable. So they turn the gas off. Right. Now, at the time, Europe was the largest consumer of gas in the world. And Russia was the largest producer and supplier of gas in the world. Right. So when that Russian gas, we can't really replace it and in the same quantities. And so Europe is now deindustrializing. So they were put into a situation which is a rock and a hard place. You will now recognize the Russian ruble, the first of the BRICS, commodities, currencies. And we said that's unacceptable, which is why we are going to war in Ukraine, which is not a European country, not a NATO country, but it's so bitter and aggressive, and there's no compromise, there's no dialogue. It's winner takes all, and the loser will lose everything. And they just keep throwing more and more and more in, and they cannot back down either side. And that's why I believe it's happening. So when we do things like so the West's strategy to try and head this off seems to be to try and sort of engage a regional war of some kind, with as both an internal distraction, but also as a way of heading off this whole strategy. What is not openly acknowledged is that we are actually at war, not just with Russia, but with China as well. And all of the BRICS nations have not actually condemned any of this. Right? So we are in and that war is multidimensional. fifth generation warfare, where lots of things are now being used. It's a war of ideas. It's economic. And so its objectives are economic, and it's about commodities. And I think it's about the crash of one currency system and the rise of another. And so it's the end of one empire and the rise of another. And the Ukraine patch of ground happens to be the football pitch that we've agreed to meet on and actually sort of have this out.
Do you,
And yeah,
no, I was going to say, do you think it expands outside of Ukraine as well?
I think we're seeing war and conflict in all sections all over the world. It's just it's visible there.
Hmm.
Like we're seeing economic sanctions from China. We're seeing India and Turkey doing things that are really sort of unfortunate for the West. They're playing the game. You know, the number of countries wanting to join the BRICS nations is now I don't know what the number is now, but it's lots and lots of countries wanting to sort of join in. The US dollar is the US government is printing more and more currency with each passing month. You know, I don't know what the true figures are because you can't believe the numbers that are actually being published, but it's something like 120 billion a month.
Hmm.
It's something like between 1 and 2 trillion a year, and the interest repayments on that debt is now actually exceeding the military budget every year. Yeah, it's yeah, and so I do think like we're seeing all over the world. Like in here in Helsinki, we've got a central train station, and to show our support for the Ukrainians, we've got a Ukrainian flag flying over the central train station. It is we are being convinced to think at an ideological level without actually looking at the practicalities. The people around me here in Finland are all reliving their worst nightmare of what happened when the Soviets tried to invade in 1939, and the Finns fought them off, and everyone's reliving that, and it's really sort of made it hard for them to see beyond that, and so it's like we are being marched into war. I believe that the Finnish frontier and the Finns are going to be deployed like an expendable chess piece, if things escalate. Um, and the locals are quite happy for that to go along because they think they can thrash the Russians. It's there are no good guys here, but we are in a very very interesting time in history. But as history changes gears, the capacity for a lot of people to get hurt is well and truly there, and it's very. These are all my personal opinions based on what I've sort of observed in putting this sort of work together and what I see. Like I'm an Australian in Europe, so I'm very much an outsider observing stuff, and some of the things I've actually sort of observed, like what actually happened in '39 was absolutely appalling. And in Australia, we've got no comparable historical incident to actually sort of understand that. Uh, but what I'm sort of seeing now, from a purely sort of math point of view, like there was a pattern I saw in the gas industry that put this together a couple of years ago, and what I'm seeing in terms of actions, and why is it that the West is so aggressive, and why is Europe collectively, without exception, in lockstep to actually destroy themselves to protect Ukraine, which is the most corrupt country on the planet. I don't know if it's the most corrupt, but it certainly, has its corruption problems. A lot of dodgy things happen there. Uh, and a lot of our military resources, like our consumables, have been thrown into Ukraine, where only a third of the weapons that we've given to them have actually made it to the front. The rest are now in organized, it was sold in the black market. And organized crime is now getting military grade weapons all over the world. What could possibly go wrong? Yeah, and so I I I sort of see this whole gambit as it was a strategy, and the next bastard move from the Russians, and they are bastards, right? Will be you will pay because they've called it the wheat market. You will pay for our wheat in rubles because Ukraine produced a lot of fertilizer, and they were the breadbasket of Europe, and the Russians produced a lot of fertilizer, and so did the Chinese. So the Chinese and the Russians together have cornered the fertilizer market. No, no, no. They've cornered a stockpile of wheat, and the fertilizer production globally has taken a hit. And so we've now got food shortages on the books a little bit down the track from that sort of impact alone. And that will be used as a weapon in this multi-dimensional war. That's it's about resources. It's all about resources. Um, yeah. So that being said, though, I live in Finland. I'm in Helsinki. I would much rather be here with all that information in context of everything else. You know, the risk of things are about to go into a shooting war and are right up against the Russia border, right? Because there are other risks in the threat matrix. Once we get past this risk, there are others. And so my wife and I have discussed this. We would prefer to be here than back in Australia.
Why is that?
Because
If you don't mind me asking.
no, no, so it's the risks that we sort of see in Australia, and because there's more than one risk on the books. There are lots of them. Like the whole Russian debacle, Ukraine debacle. There's one issue of many, and when you actually put them all together, because the Finnish culture here is remarkable. Um, Once we actually get past the hard part, the Finnish culture is much stronger and more resilient than any other group I've seen in the world in terms of actually meeting the challenges ahead of us in terms of how do they restructure their society to actually meet these challenges. There is a strength to them, and they have a sense of honor that will carry them through all hardships. Right. So, and even though I'm an expat and I would never be accepted ultimately by the Finnish society, I think the society itself will last long term much better than many other societies I've come across in my travels. In Australia, what we saw during the COVID era was that the Australian government is no longer, it's no longer a sense. It is degrading into a police state. During the COVID era, the Prime Minister Scott Morrison, I think it was 2020, quietly absorbed the portfolios of four ministers. One of them was the health minister. The ministers themselves didn't know, and they were continuing to go to Parliament. But the Prime Minister just taken their authority, and what he did, no one knows. Right. So while COVID was happening, which was a medical emergency of unprecedented nature, right, the Prime Minister made a series of actions using the authority of the Health Minister and others. All records about what he did have been destroyed, as in we don't know. The government that came in after him, which is the current one, which is a Labour government, and by the Prime Minister was called Anthony Albanese. Right. They rode to victory on the idea of having a royal inquiry into COVID and a royal, as in their actions during COVID, and a royal inquiry asking what did Scott Morrison actually do in that time. And both have been forgotten and brushed under the carpet. And the media is mainstream media has gone along with that. Now, what that told me is at a very structural level and at a deep structural level that Australia has a level of corruption there that is on par with what we're seeing in the United States. A lot of the decisions being made in Australia are very, they're rolling out a series of surveillance apparatuses that worry the hell out of me. And the culture that is there, because Australia is quite spread out and everything, that there is no resilience in terms of in the face of adversity. Here in Finland, for example, there is a stockpile of all necessary goods and needs for the people in Finland for 8 months. Right, and they maintain that stockpile. It's not perfect, right, but there's a stockpile, and there's a group that reports to Finnish Parliament that actually thinks in these terms. In Australia, they did a fuel security supply, and they found that there was only a couple of days of food and fuel and pharmaceuticals in the system. So if there was any kind of disruption of ships coming to Australia, for example, through the Hormuz Strait, for example, oil and petroleum, then their duck is cooked, and they're going to sort of, So there's a series of problems in Australia, and there's a series of problems in other countries around the world that I've seen.
What do you think about the United States?
So the United States is a very, very unusual case because of its size and its place on the world stage. So I've I've decided that Finland, for example, for now, is the most resilient place to ride out the next couple of years. And with the idea that there is a list of pros and cons with everywhere you go. United States is another one of those. Like, the long-term prospects of the United States are good because there are still a continent of pristine resources, whereas Europe's been mining its resources for a long time, and there's a lot of development here. And there's an industrialization capacity in the United States that could be restarted. Whereas here in Europe, we haven't done mining here in a long time in a sensible fashion. So long term, the United States could reindustrialize itself relatively quickly, right? But it's got some terrible, terrible problems in terms of its administration. And socially, it has now been conditioned to be at war with itself in a fashion where the people involved have no idea that this has happened. So in the short term, you've got quite a lot of volatility, and you've got a very tribal sort of situation where people will happily fight each other. And you've got to get past that, then cooperate and agree to come together as a group. Then you can start talking about, well, how do we fix this and how do we get past this? I also think that the leadership of the United States, what I'm talking about is the real government behind who gets elected. Their actions are there for the world to see. You know, they just a presidential candidate has been subject to legal lawfare now for years. They've been trying to jail him. There was an assassination attempt against Trump where he was almost shot in the head. And it's very apparent to the casual observer that both the FBI and the Secret Service are complicit in that. And so we're not stupid, right? The implications of that, of the rot that's actually at the very center of the system. Democracy, the normal things associated with democracy have been suspended in many respects. You've also got, I believe the United States is in an unconventional conflict, probably with China. But certainly there's an adversary that is actually engaging in a multidimensional conflict for some time now. And I think the Americans are asleep at the wheel. Now, the true implications of that are not understood yet. And so when that comes apart, and when that sort of blows up in everyone's face, you're going to have a couple of very difficult years. Now, here in Finland, people trust each other. There is a community. People trust their government, even though the government, I believe, has done a few things that I don't like. But the police are trusted, and the police trust the community, and there is transparency, right? So there is a strength here that I don't see anywhere else in the world. Now, in America, or in Australia in particular, there is no trust. Everyone's very cynical. And the idea that, there is corruption, well, of course there is. Pass the salt. Right. And so we can all trundle along while everything works and everything's fine. And then, the money, the FPOS system still works, and there's money in the bank, and there's food in the supermarkets. But when we start hitting these sort of disruptions that are modeled, and next year is going to be a rough year according to some of these, it's like they all come into alignment in the third quarter next year. Everyone around the world is going to have a bad hair day.
What happens? What happens in the third quarter next year?
So there's a series of predictions, and they're predictions. So like all other predictions, you got to take them with a grain of salt, but you see them as trends. And so sometime next year, or third quarter next year, is the debt saturation problem, especially in the United States, but also in Europe as a global system. It reaches a point where the amount of money being printed will incur an interest on repayments, and that interest repayments will exceed the amount of money that is actually in the economy to pay that debt. right? And so then you're in the vertical part of the hyperinflation curve. That's unless something drastic happens, that happens sometime next year. Then you've got the problems of the food shortages issues. The food production all around the world. The United States in particular has had a lot of problems in its food production. Like there's been a lot of breakdowns and things blowing up and not repaired, and the food system's under quite a bit of strain. But when the actual thing of not enough fertilizer starts to ripple through, we've got to fall back on stockpiles, the global stockpiles of food, only to find that they have been geopolitically weaponized. That'll become an issue next year as well. At the same time, the oil production in the tight oil sector in the United States, um, there were predictions that it was going to actually sort of roll over later this year, but one of the fracking fields has actually been more productive than we thought it would be. And so now it's probably next year sometime. Whether it is next year or not, or the year after, it's around now. Now, the implications of these issues are quite large and will take years to fix. The fact that we're seeing them all at once is a problem. There's copper shortages in the day-to-day production of copper, and we're more and more reliant on the recycling of copper to meet demand. But we're just not producing enough. It's not economically viable to actually have a copper mine open because the amount of money you've got to put on the ground and how long it takes to get your money back. You know, we're back to the idea that the world is virtual and we can put the money in the stock market and get the same result in 6 weeks instead of 10, 15 years. So we've got a number of problems on the books that are coming together, and they're visible now that everyone can now see them. Um, but we're all sort of determined to argue who's going to the bathroom. You know, you know the idea that the most pressing concern ahead of us now is racism. So my genetics, my family actually did a family tree, and I got the genetics looked at. About 24% of my genetics comes from Southern Asia, also known as India.
Mm.
So I'm actually not white, all black, right? But when you actually sort of get pinned in these conversations, and I get accused of a racist white guy, and I'm going,
What would they call you, racist?
well, we were having a debate on something. What was it? That's right. It was how gas was used in industry, right? And when the debate wasn't going their way, I was accused of racism
Oh.
and white privilege. And so it, it yeah that really sort of tells me that we're in a place of extreme tribalism that's not based on logic, and it's based on emotional belief. And I'm thinking, what for example, when the Trump assassination attempt happened, my immediate reaction was, I have no sympathy for Trump's supporters, Trump's opponents, sorry, Trump's opponents, because now they've actually crossed the Rubicon, and instead of actually sort of meeting him in a proper democratic election, they're using dirty pool tactics to try and remove him from the stage. Now, Trump's supporters, on the other hand, are also not across all problems either. That everyone's been convinced to actually look at the surface stuff, and they're ignoring all the deeper stuff. And so it's not an environment where you can actually have an intelligent conversation as such. And so it's just step out, lead into it,
Yeah.
watch what happens, be very far away when it does.
Yeah,
It's
yeah. I mean, I'm kind of in the same boat as you are. I really don't want to be involved in any of this, and just want to watch it, watch it as a spectator. But
we're all in the same boat. Like for the last, everyone from nation states to individuals like you and I are jockeying to maneuver ourselves to be in the best position possible as we go through this transition. So the transition is things are getting harder and harder and harder, little by little by little, and then something important will break, and then we'll have everything happen all at once, and then it gets harder and harder and harder until we stabilize on the other side. How do we position ourselves so both us and our families are in a place where we're not going to get caught as the gears change? Yeah, as I like to say, don't be in the middle of a herd that's sitting on top of a cliff when someone shouts, "Yo, shit's on fire," and stampedes off the cliff. Don't be in the middle of that herd. Be on one side of the herd that's actually on the right side that can just quietly sort of just move away without
Hmm.
getting run over. How do we do that? Right. And so that requires us to understand what we're seeing. And while it's stressful and people are not very, don't find this very popular, they don't want to hear this stuff. You tend to get accused of all sorts of things. But what it does mean is when we start seeing challenging things, you and I have the luxury of not panicking. It's not that we won't get caught by the same things, but we at least don't panic and we can understand what we're looking at. And that will allow us to problem solve more effectively while everyone else is in a trance state because they're panicking.
Right.
And yeah,
No, I was just gonna say. I think we're getting close to time here, Simon. Quickly, tell
sure.
where can people find you, Simon?
Okay, I have a personal website, simonmichaux.com. Uh, that's where I try and put all my work up. I'm also an advisor to the Venus Project, thevenusproject.com. Um, yes, and I'm actually publishing stuff in journals. And if you put
Excellent.
my search name into YouTube, a few of my examples will come up.
All right, we'll get your links down below. Be sure to check them out, guys. They'll be in the description box down below. And I'd like to remind you to hit that like button if you enjoyed this video. Also, write "Go Simon Go" in the comments if you agreed with Simon. If you didn't agree with Simon, however, tell me why. Tell me what you disagreed with. Really interested to get your take here, guys. Also, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It does help and does go a long way in growing our reach, getting us more guests like Simon and so forth. So with that said, you guys, I will catch you in the next episode. Bye, y'all.
Bye.